Darya Saltykova, an 18th-century serial killer of Russia. When you think criminal, who pops into your head? Probably a shadowy figure lurking in a dark corner? Maybe a cunning mastermind behind a heist? But what if the reality is far more surprising? This is Robber's Insights, and today we will unfold the story of a noblewoman whose crimes are so chilling that they still terrify anyone who dares to explore them even after 3 centuries. Ever since humans have started to walk on this planet, we can clearly tell from history that the ancient figures were not all perfect and revolutionary. Instead, they often committed such horrendous and brutal crimes that we can't even think of. One such figure was Darya Saltykova, a noblewoman from the 18th century whose series of crimes continue to terrify the readers, even today. She was famous for her unusual methods of torture to assert authority over her serfs. Her criminal record included countless accounts of torture, flogging, psychological trauma, and eventually murder of umpteen amount of serfs. Born in 1730, Darya Saltykova was a member of Russia's noble family. While she lived a perfect life with her husband Gleb Saltykov and 2 sons, the early death of her husband in marriage changed her forever. It was the ultimate power in her hands that exposed the deeper human instincts of power and the darker side of human beings. The thought of possessing significant property and power over other people turned Darya Saltykova into an evil, criminal being. Her reign was marked by autocracy, her desire to rule the people with an iron fist. As time continued to grow, her abuse of the people became more intense, and several events of innocent lives being taken away were witnessed. Eventually, she was nicknamed Salty Chica, a term that became synonymous with ruthless and sadistic owners. Eventually, the suffering of the serfs caught the attention of Empress Catherine II, which led to investigations being conducted under her order. Consequently, Darya Saltykova was found guilty of over 100 murders and sentenced to life in solitary confinement. Now, as we tell you of the ultimate fate of Darya Saltykova and the consequences of her actions on the feudal system, her brutality and heinous crimes speak for themselves. Saltykova's most appalling acts were often directed towards young female serfs. She had earned a notorious image for flogging and torturing them. On several occasions, the torture continued till one of the subjects would lose their life. The serfs felt completely powerless to protect their daughters and hoped for mercy, but none was granted by Saltykova. Similarly, it was the chilling practice of Saltykova to pour boiling water over her victims, subjecting them to extreme temperatures in the harsh Russian winters, or even forcing the serfs to consume excessive amounts of substances. Saltykova's horrendous crimes continued to oppress and develop the fear of life among the serfs. What added to her cruelty were her roots, her belongingness to the noble family, which meant no immediate legal procedures, and her royal status that gave her excessive freedom of power to do things as she wished. Despite Saltykova's heinous crimes, she did not get her satisfaction. Instead, she forced herself to exercise power even more strongly. Her monstrous actions on the ordinary citizens knew no boundaries and drew no sympathy in her heart. In her mind, she felt like a deity and claimed the role of a ruthless goddess whose wrath knew no limits over the unfortunate souls whose only mistake was being born in the same time frame and region as she did. From a historian's viewpoint, Saltykova viewed the serfs as only play toys who could be molded and destroyed as her mood dictated. Since Saltykova belonged to the Russian nobility, she naturally yielded significant power and authority over the serfs. She abused her position of privilege and went on to torture the innocent serfs who resided under her authority. At the time, serfs had little to no power, and a proper legal structure to protect their basic human rights did not exist. This loophole was exploited by Saltykova, who satisfied her sadistic impulses without fear of any consequence of her actions. Saltykova's abuse of power highlighted the systematic inequalities that existed at the time in Russia and the injustices inherent in the feudal system, where the nobility went unchecked for their authority and actions. Saltykova's most heinous crime was taking innocent lives by murdering the serfs. While official figures are not known, at her trial she was found guilty of more than 100 murders. Yes, you heard it right. What is even more horrifying about her murders is that they were not isolated acts of violence. Instead, there was a series of systematic actions against those who were under her control. While the exact motive of each murder remains mysterious, it often originated from her desire for absolute power and the horrendous pleasure she got from torturing people to death. So the victims did not only undergo an incident that led to death, but also experienced prolonged periods of torture and extreme suffering that would ultimately claim their lives. Now, even though murder might be an extreme form of her crimes, torturing serfs was the primary action that pleased her sadistic nature. According to the reports, the serfs were subjected to a variety of cruel and gruesome methods, including beating, burning, mutilation, and even severe forms of physical abuse. As if physical injuries were not enough, her victims were also not free from the psychological damage she caused. Those who recovered from physical injuries fell to the trauma they experienced often and suffered from permanent changes in their psychological behavior. The purpose of this torture was not only to inflict pain on the serfs, but also for them to realize that she was the only one who held the ultimate authority and total control over their lives. It was this weird psychological nature of Saltykova that made her derive pleasure from the sufferings of others. Her acts of torture were meant to assert authority and instill fear among those under her power. Along with the torture, whipping, boiling water, and whatnot, Saltykova's serfs were not even safe from the sexual abuse. In addition to the physical and psychological torture, and even taking the lives of innocent serfs, multiple accounts suggest that Saltykova subjected her female serfs to various forms of sexual abuse. She primarily targeted young female serfs, often stripping them naked before inflicting severe beatings and other forms of physical abuse. She would humiliate them and be as cruel to them as possible to assert her dominance and control. This act of stripping was not only a method to increase the pain, but also served as a form of sexual humiliation. She would use instruments like whips, rods, and burning objects, inflicting injuries that were both physically excruciating and sexually violating. Before we discuss how people revolted against her and how her official trial began, a question tickles our minds. Why did she not fear the law at the time, and no legal bodies held her accountable as she continued to satisfy her sadistic pleasures? Well, there is no single answer to this. A combination of factors assisted her in avoiding capital punishment and standing before the law. The first reason was her nobility. Saltykova was a member of the Russian noble family and possessed considerable wealth. It was her high social standing as an aristocrat which provided her with a certain degree of immunity and protection from any form of accusations. When we consider that time frame, in the 18th century in Russia, the legal framework was not as efficient, and particularly not against individuals with noble status, so they were less likely to be investigated or prosecuted. Secondly, Saltykova's sadistic nature had the biggest blow on the weakest members of the community, the serfs. Most of her victims were ordinary laborers who were considered the property of the nobility. Serfs had very few rights, and their awareness and exposure of them was even lesser, so they were not able to seek justice as easily as other members of society. Even if a serf would gather up the courage to submit a complaint, it was either ignored or dismissed as less important by the authorities, especially when they were against someone of Saltykova's status. As mentioned before, Saltykova's family was the Russian nobility, the aristocrats of the society. Their friends and relatives secured the highest positions in society, so Saltykova naturally had powerful connections with the Russian authorities and possibly within the local legal system. This network of influence and alliances provided her with a safety and security net, which helped her suppress any investigations or allegations against her filed by the serfs. Darya Saltykova's brutality and torture created an atmosphere of fear and intimidation among her serfs and others who might have known about her crimes. This fear of being subject to her gruesome nature and extreme form of violence discouraged potential witnesses or victims from coming forward to file complaints against her. While feelings of hatred for Saltykova existed among serfs, they failed to gather the courage to stand up against her, as their hopelessness of the judiciary system was low and fear of being buried in the cemetery was high. Some historians consider the period in Russian history when Saltykova committed her crimes as favorable to her injustices. At the time, it was difficult to produce concrete evidence or witnesses willing to testify. It would have been very difficult to build a case against her. Similarly, 3 centuries ago, they lacked modern forensic techniques, which meant that much of the evidence relied on testimony. As we previously explained, the environment of fear and intimidation discouraged serfs to testify, as it put their lives at risk as well. Another problem that leveraged Saltykova even further was the delayed response from the authorities. It was difficult for serfs to complain in the first place. Even if they gathered the courage to file official complaints, the authorities were extremely slow in catering them to their issues. It was only after numerous complaints were made to Empress Catherine II that a formal investigation was launched to study the crimes. It was this investigation that eventually revealed the extent of Saltykova's crimes, under which she was found guilty and sentenced to death in solitary confinement. It eventually brings us to the question, were people so hopeless and weak as to not overthrow her power until the Empress took action? The reality is that the serfs took a series of actions to overthrow her. Despite the ruthlessness and fear of Saltykova, the serfs became desperate for relief and reached a point where they could not take her brutality anymore. They knew complaining against a noble could result in severe punishment to them. Still, some serfs managed to gather the courage to file a complaint against Saltykova, to hold her accountable for her crimes and end the reign of unbearable cruelty they were facing. The first practical step that the serfs took was filing official complaints to local authorities, but they were either dismissed, ignored, or had pending status for prolonged periods, primarily because Saltykova's noble status brought her a wide network and connections that helped her against the serfs. Once the serfs realized that local authorities were too weak to operate independently, they aimed higher by mutually deciding to complain to the higher authorities. The moment of change in their campaign against Saltykova first came when 2 serfs, Semyon Martynov and Yermolai Ilyin, managed to get a petition to Russia's highest authority, the Empress. Their successful planning came in handy as they bypassed the traditional channels and reached the highest authority in Russia directly. At the time, it was completely against the customary tradition of sending messages to the Empress herself, but the two managed to successfully reach through the direct option. At the time, Russia's highest authority was Empress Catherine II, later regarded for her interest in Enlightenment ideas and legal reforms. When Empress Catherine II received the petition, she saw this as the perfect opportunity to showcase to ordinary citizens her commitment to justice and reforms. Catherine's inclination towards changes and reforms, and her desire to portray herself as a ruler with characteristics of being just and promoting equality for all, led her to take the complaints of the serfs very seriously and avail the opportunity to improve her relations with the public. Once the complaints of the serfs had reached the highest authority in Russia, Empress Catherine II ordered a thorough investigation into the activities of Saltykova. The investigation was conducted by a special commission that the Empress herself set up. This special commission included officials who were not directly influenced by the local noble interests in any way. The commission collected testimonies from numerous witnesses, including victims who managed to survive, and other serfs who had observed the brutality and torture of Saltykova on fellow serfs. The investigation revealed tons of evidence of Saltykova's crimes, including numerous testimonies from witnesses who described the torture and murder of many serfs that Saltykova had conducted. The sheer volume of evidence and the consistency of the account provided by the investigators provided a compelling case against her, out of which it was difficult to come out clean for Saltykova. Once enough evidence was gathered and an investigation was completed as per the orders of Empress Catherine II, Saltykova was brought to the court for her trial. The court was presented with overwhelming evidence, and the high-profile nature of the case, the trial eventually resulted in a conviction. Saltykova admitted her crime and was found guilty of the torture and murder of dozens of serfs. It was the year 1768 that came with joy for the serfs, as their biggest oppressor was sentenced to life imprisonment. Darya Saltykova was publicly shamed in Moscow. She was chained on a platform in Moscow for an entire hour. This was a common method of public humiliation at the time, intended to expose criminals to public scorn and shame. Above the head of Darya Saltykova, a sign was placed that clearly described her crime. The sign read, "This woman has tortured and murdered." This made it clear to all onlookers why she was being punished and served to inform the public of her monstrous deeds. During the entire hour of being chained, Darya Saltykova experienced the pain she inflicted upon the serfs. This form of punishment was not just physically uncomfortable for her, but also aimed to psychologically break her by exposing her to public hatred and contempt. Followed up by this public humiliation and massive triumph for the serfs, Saltykova was sent to Ivanovsky convent in Moscow, where she completed her punishment by spending the rest of her life in solitary confinement. Darya Saltykova's trial was a victory for the working class. For them, it had little to do with legal proceedings, but more with a public event. For the serfs, Darya was simply a result of excessive power and authority that naturally came from Russia's noble family. This would eventually lead to the emancipation reform of 1861 that would free the serfs and end the feudal system that had long oppressed them. Although Saltykova's crimes are no secret, at this point, her criminal records are debatable. Some claim that the royal family of Russia at the time burnt most of it, while others claim that they were lost when the uprising of the Russian Revolution came forward a century and a half later. While the true, accurate records may be missing, folk tales and stories continue to be a part of Russia's culture, which views Saltykova as a symbol of evilness and monstrous authority. The justice for the serfs and the conviction of Darya Saltykova did not end the case then and there, but it left us with key lessons for the future. The case of Darya Saltykova requires special attention due to major reasons. The first is that it was the first major instance in recent Russian history where the authority of a noble person was questioned against the complaints of ordinary people. The lack of a judicial system and failure to hold nobility questionable was one of the key reasons for Saltykova's merciless actions. But in an extremely rare occasion, justice was served, and the idea that even nobility could be questioned prevailed across the aristocracies that came later. The second reason was the encouragement of legal reforms in all societies. The act of kindness by Empress Catherine II led to the development of the idea that legal reforms must be implemented equally across the board, and the protection of minorities and weak people must be prioritized. For the nations and societies that emerged later, justice became a key pillar of any progressive nation. The distinction between a developing and developing society could be. This brings us to the end of Darya Saltykova's life, an individual who experienced the great luxury of life and ultimate authority, and temporarily acted as a goddess with infinite power, but her life turned around when his power was challenged, and the very feudal system which entertained her power turned against her. Her desire to punish people converted into her empty life when she spent the rest of her life in solitary confinement. Comment below the video and let us know about your thoughts on the life of Darya Nikolaevna Saltykova. We hope you enjoyed the video and appreciate our content. Like, comment, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on a new story. And until next time, stay curious.